The Westminster Consortium, as Linda said, started in 2004, and it was, 2007, and was put together specifically to help with the Deferred Governance and Transparency Fund program, which we had and which was funded going forward. And it worked in 6 countries: Lebanon, Uganda, Mozambique, Morocco, Ukraine, and Georgia. And what I'd like to do is just go through the context of it, go through a bit of what the challenges were, our thinking before the midterm review, our thinking after the midterm review, what we've achieved, and if we were to do this thing differently. I'll try to go through this fairly quickly, but roughly around 2008, when we started the program, we were dealing with 2 countries in Eastern Europe, 2 countries in the Middle East, 2 countries in Africa. And there were several differences in their context. Some parliaments had strong ruling parties at the time. Example was Georgia, Uganda, and Mozambique. Some parties had no majority parliament, so they had to work through coalitions or factions such as Ukraine, Lebanon, Morocco. There was religious and ethnical representation in Lebanon. Countries were coming out of conflict. Countries like Uganda had come out of conflict. Mozambique had come out of conflict. Georgia had just come out of a war. And Lebanon was also a country that had come out of a degree of conflict. We had countries that were transitioning out of an old Soviet system into new democratic systems like Ukraine and Georgia. We had countries that had were coming out of either a single party or no party system. We had like Uganda and Mozambique. We had countries where new parties were constantly built around personalities. And that's funny, because we could say that there are quite a few new parties in the UK that are coming out of personalities. But there is this growing trend of a multitude of parties that are less on ideology, but more on personalities. And that seems to be increasing. We've got countries that were struggling with corruption and crime. But finally, there was this general feeling that almost all the parliaments we worked to some degree, were working with a population that had low trust and confidence. And that seems to have been a general state in around 2004. And so the concept at that time was to try to build these circles of support, as Linda said, to find a sustainable way of building capacity. And what were we trying? Why was this important to us? Because after every election, we were seeing high turnover of staff and members. Most capacity initiatives were short-term. Some parliaments did not have strengthened human resource systems. The legislative environment was too small in a lot of cases to warrant your universities or academic institutions setting up a specific academy to deal with legislative strengthening. We also had a situation where there was not always sufficient knowledge. One of the important things that we tried to do through this program was to recognize that the core knowledge in the legislative sectors is in the parliament, and how do we move the parliament to start to expose that knowledge? So the approach we took was very simple. Was to establish parliamentary centers to encourage, to organize and coordinate capacity building, pair local and international partners on thematic areas, encourage the local development and ownership of curriculum, using trainer-of-trainer programs to develop internal trainers, use curriculum localization visits, especially some coming to the UK to gain best practice and gain new knowledge to take back. We supported the joint delivery of courses between international and local partners. We encouraged the inclusion of local partners in parliamentary workshops and activities, and we encouraged South-South exchanges between the 6 countries that were part of our program. This probably demonstrates our initial thinking at the time, and that was that we could have a parliamentary studies center like in Uganda with its local trainers. We could build a support of local partners who had grown in capacity over a period of time that could thematically help the Parliament. We could support them with international expertise from TWC partners and hopefully see a much more global relationship building across the partners. And I would say that the first 3 circles worked really well. The 4th circle worked really well in certain thematic areas like human rights. There was a great sharing of issues in human rights. And we could even have these smaller rings of thematic relationships that bring the various partners across. We tested this for 2 years. We saw the successes, we saw the weaknesses, but most of all, we were seeing what we could learn from that approach. It was a very good approach. I think that most people would say that in a way it achieved more than we thought we would initially achieve. Some of the lessons were that there was importance in choosing partners that shared the same value, that there would be 2 different types of partners, but some partners shared greater values of democracy and they would stick with the Parliament. We would see that capacity building was linked closely with political will, and there were certain things that we would make a lot more progress on than in other areas. And we worked primarily in 5 thematic areas, which was civil society, human rights, access to information, financial oversight, and parliamentary process and management. We saw that as we increased the linkages and the contact with Parliament, Parliament started to trust the relationships better. And we'd start to see an inclusion of partners in planning, in thinking, in cooperation. But we also started to see that there were some challenges. Using a lot of CSOs in capacity building of the Parliament meant that parliaments had to adjust to the fact that one day a CSO can be a capacity building partner and the next day a CSO is a political advocate. And so this relationship of how do you relate with a CSO sometimes can be quite complex. I can see my Ukrainian friends smiling about that. So what was the progress? We saw an acceptance of local partners. We saw the development of the knowledge base of local partners. We saw improvement in the quality of briefs and materials produced by committees. We saw greater accountability in financial tools being used, links between supreme audit institutions coming together. But more than anything, we saw a remarkable increase in the amount of capacity building and the value for money of this approach and the number of courses that suddenly were being generated in a parliament. And that was probably one of the key things. We went through a midterm review, and the midterm review said 6 things to us. It said, apply a results-focused model. It said link training with practical support. In other words, where are the blockages that prevent us from moving to capacity building to impact? It said strengthen the networks, especially the networks that were appearing organically, like the journalistic networks. Support the institutionalization of the human resource development. In other words, focus a lot more on the internal trainers. Target political support on key change champions. And finally, implement a stronger strategic program management approach. Basically, they said that the program was too broad. We had gone out over 2 years. We've applied an approach. It had successes. But with the remaining 2 years, be focused on what you can achieve. So go for the wins. And that required us to think a lot broader and a lot more holistically about the entire process, because we also need to realize that around 2010, the whole environment, donor environment, had also changed. It became an impact-oriented and a results-oriented environment. So we were no longer being told, go build the capacity of an institution. We were told, go build the capacity of an institution, but prove that their people are getting more water in their houses. And the linkage is just so broad. And that's going to be a challenge with every donor program into the future. So we had to realize that the way the chain does work is that civil society, CSOs, parliaments, political parties engage with parliaments. If they engage well, it produces good legislation, conducts better oversight, represents the needs of the people. That results in better service delivery, greater transparency, greater freedom and human rights, and ultimately leads to a better quality of life. You had to, at the end of the day, evidence this chain works. But we had to also realize that it doesn't work always because it often isn't fixed and is imperfect. So we started realizing, firstly, we got to strengthen the mechanisms and capacity to participate in the legislative and political process. So it's not good enough that we open up to civil society. If the civil society can't present something in a useful form, Parliament can't use it. We needed to develop institutional capacity of the Parliament. And thirdly, we needed to ensure that our programs helped strengthen the links between participation, legislative action, and development. We had to start to think broader than just the capacity building element of the Parliament. An example of that would be the first stage is get media, civil society, and parliaments to raise political issues and concerns. Legislative mechanisms are strengthened. Then legislation is produced, either legislation of oversight, and finally that the oversight and legislation process has an impact. And an example will be in Ukraine, and we're probably going to hear a lot more of this tomorrow, where the CSOs raised the issue of human trafficking victims in Ukraine. They interacted with the committee that had then been strengthened to deal and engage with civil society and the new EU guidance on this issue. They produced what most people consider a very good law on human trafficking. But later what was realized is, on the monitoring side, that the government was not funding the law. So it's almost taking the process back. And that's sort of an example of how we're trying to look at the broad expanse of the project and see how in future we can build programs that take everything into consideration. We had some key assumptions, some of them changed over time, that there's a free and enabling environment to achieve political participation, that there is political will to effect change. That was not always the case. It differed in parliaments. Funny enough, changes in elections brought about substantial changes in political will, especially in Uganda and Morocco. We saw a change of an election brought in a considerable amount of political will just because of the nature of that process. That there is sufficient incentive to introduce change. There's sufficient local ownership for the change. And finally, we needed to be certain that we were matching what we were doing with the demands of the Parliament and the CSOs, cautious about what the donor environment was expecting, but sometimes what the donor environment found interesting, the Parliament didn't. And so there's a matching process that needs to happen. 2010 saw some fundamental changes in the political environment, not just in the UK, but globally, and across several TWC countries that also advanced the program. Just to give you some examples of some of our results, a lot of this you'll see over the next 2 days and you can interrogate in more detail. In Mozambique, we saw improved linkages between Parliament and CSOs. In Ukraine, we saw increased access and openness of the Parliament and media engagement on human rights issues. We saw the Ombudsman participate more in the Human Rights Committee meetings. In Uganda, we saw the establishment of a Human Rights Committee. In Mozambique, we supported the development of the Rights of Information Bill, Solid Waste Management Bill, the Law on Agriculture Bill. We're contributing towards the establishment of a Moroccan Public Accounts Committee. We hope that will come to be in the next few months. In Uganda, we've seen the Parliament establish the Parliamentary Study Center. We'll see that more of that in the next session. The Arab Institute for Parliamentary Training and Legislative Studies to capacitate the region. The establishment of a Parliamentary Studies Center in Mozambique to strengthen national and the local legislative sector. We've seen research improve in the Ugandan Parliament. We've seen the quality of reporting, committee reports improved in Georgia. And the Parliament and governmental agencies become more access due to the new freedom of information law in Ukraine. And we're also going to hear about that today. And then we looked at the creation of the journalism network, Rejapan, in Mozambique. These are probably a summary of an initial list of about 24 proposals that are most significant results that have come forward. And we're working through them to see what is significant, what is provable, where do we have sufficient evidence to support it. If I was asked the question, what could we do differently? If we had chosen rather than 6 countries across 6 regions and we had talked about working in one region with 6 countries, we probably would have a different result in terms of depth, but I'm not sure we would have got a better result in terms of the richness of learning. I think that there was a richness in the learning of the TWC program because it took those 3 regions. I think the approach was successful. I would have liked to maybe have brought in the CSO component in a larger way right at the beginning. That would, I think, have made a substantial difference in the way the results came out. And finally, I think we can design better programs because we have all the building blocks. It's amazing that actually UK, we don't have an IRI, we don't have an NDI, but we have sufficient small specialized organizations that if they work together, can really put together some really good programs that create synergy and complementarity. But it did take time for us to learn the strengths and weaknesses of our different partners, both at the UK level and within countries. And I think that does say that maybe our weakness was that we probably should have taken a lot more in the inception phase to work out our strengths and weaknesses better. But having said that, that's a lesson learned for me. But having said that, I think that overall we did do a very good program, and I'm really appreciative of all the program staff in country that put the program together.